What if I told you America's 45 presidential departures include a president who fled Washington at 4 in the morning to avoid watching his successor take the oath? 8 men who died in office while doctors insisted they were recovering just fine, and one who resigned on national television then. Helicoptered away giving victory signs? For 240 years, power has changed hands in this country through every possible method: assassination, resignation, impeachment, death by medical incompetence, and occasionally, almost shockingly, through simple democratic tradition. Some left gracefully. Some left in caskets. 4 refused to attend their successors' inaugurations, breaking a tradition that took generations to establish. The record is there, documented in congressional proceedings, hospital logs, resignation letters, and flight manifests. Subscribe. We're covering all 45 departures, one after another, in chronological order. Get comfortable, pour something warm, settle in for the night, because the presidential seal has been transferred, inherited, abandoned, and fought over for 2.5 centuries. And the ways it changed hands tell you everything about how American power actually works. The first departure happened in Philadelphia, not Washington. The capital hadn't moved yet. On March 3rd, 1797, George Washington spent his final day as president in the temporary executive mansion on Market Street, a rented 3-story brick house that served as the nation's first White House. The rooms smelled of lamp oil, and the March cold seeped through windows that didn't quite fit their frames. Washington attended to routine paperwork with the methodical calm of a man who'd been counting down to this moment for 8 years. His secretary, Tobias Lear, documented the final cabinet meeting that afternoon. Brief, businesslike, unremarkable. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no farewell speeches. Washington had already published his farewell address 6 months earlier, in September 1796, establishing what would become the template for presidential exits, the reflective goodbye, the warnings about faction and foreign entanglement, the performance of reluctance masking genuine relief. The revolutionary thing wasn't what Washington said that final day. It was what he did the next morning. March 4th, 1797 arrived cold and clear. The kind of early spring day where your breath still fogs in the morning air. Washington dressed carefully, as he always did. He understood the theater of leadership, knew that dignity was performed through details. He rode in his carriage to Congress Hall, the temporary Capitol building at 6th and Chestnut Streets, arriving early enough to secure a seat with a clear view of the proceedings. John Adams, his vice president for 8 years, would become the second president that day. Their relationship had cooled considerably. Political disagreements, personality clashes, the inevitable resentment between a legendary founder and his ambitious successor. But Washington attended anyway. He sat through the ceremony in silence, watching Adams take the oath and deliver an inaugural address that was more nervous than inspiring. And then Washington did something that seems almost mundane now, but was genuinely radical in 1797. He simply left. He offered his congratulations to Adams, accepted the polite acknowledgments from those around him, and departed Congress Hall as a private citizen. No declaration that the Republic couldn't survive without him. No suggestion that perhaps the Constitution should be amended to let him stay. No coup attempt, no power grab, no indication that he considered himself indispensable. He climbed into his carriage and began the 7-day journey back to Mount Vernon, traveling through the same Virginia countryside he'd once led armies across. Martha Washington had spent the previous weeks packing their belongings, eager to leave Philadelphia's political atmosphere behind. She'd never enjoyed being the president's wife. The public scrutiny, the formal entertaining, the careful navigation of political factions. The household staff at Mount Vernon had been notified of their imminent return. Everything had been arranged with the same attention to detail Washington brought to military campaigns. In letters written during his final weeks in office, Washington described himself as feeling like a prisoner released from chains, the kind of honest exhaustion you don't usually see in official presidential correspondence. The relief was genuine and documented across multiple letters to friends. He'd spent 8 years trying to hold together a republic that had never existed before, mediating between Hamilton's financial schemes and Jefferson's agricultural vision, watching his cabinet split into opposing factions while he tried to maintain neutrality, navigating between British naval provocations and French revolutionary enthusiasm. The job had aged him visibly. He was 65, and the presidency had added a decade to his appearance. Here's what made Washington's departure revolutionary. What made it matter more than any battle he'd won: he proved the office was temporary. European monarchs didn't leave thrones voluntarily. They died on them, or were removed by violence, execution, exile. But Washington walked away, establishing that American power would transfer peacefully according to calendar and constitution, not death or force. It was such a simple act that its radicalism is easy to miss 2 centuries later. King George III, when told Washington planned to resign and return to his farm, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did exactly that. He attended Adams's inauguration, then rode home to manage his plantation and breed mules and correspond with scientists about crop rotation. The precedent he established was more important than any policy he'd implemented. The mechanics of the transfer were straightforward because there was no real governmental machinery yet to transfer. No vast executive departments, no permanent staff, no institutional memory, no established bureaucracy. Washington handed Adams a small federal government, some unresolved diplomatic crises with Britain and France, and the weight of everyone's expectations. Adams moved into the same rented house Washington had occupied. The presidential seal, such as it was, transferred between 2 men who'd worked together through the Revolution and now barely spoke to each other, their friendship corroded by political disagreement and mutual disappointment. Washington attended the ceremony anyway. That mattered more than the personal resentment. He proved you could dislike your successor and still respect the system enough to show up. By March 9th, Washington was back at Mount Vernon, immediately immersing himself in plantation management and agricultural experiments. He wrote to friends about crop rotation and breeding mules, subjects that apparently interested him more than foreign policy ever had. He ordered new equipment, planned building projects, reorganized his fields. The transition was documented in his correspondence: relief, satisfaction, a kind of determined ordinariness. He'd proved something unprecedented: that power in America would be limited, that leadership would rotate, that the republic could survive its founder's departure. The building didn't have to stay the same. The person didn't have to stay. But the system could continue. Every peaceful transfer of power for the next 2 centuries would reference, consciously or not, the precedent Washington established that March morning when he simply showed up, watched someone else take the oath, and left. 4 years later, on March 4th, 1801, that precedent shattered. John Adams woke in the unfinished president's house in the new capital city of Washington before dawn. The building was still under construction, unplastered walls and incomplete rooms. The capital city itself barely more than muddy streets and scattered buildings carved out of malarial swamp. Adams ordered his carriage prepared in darkness. By 4 o'clock in the morning, while the city still slept, he was gone. The sound of horses' hooves on muddy roads faded north toward Massachusetts as Adams fled the capital, determined to be far away before Thomas Jefferson took the oath at noon. The first broken tradition in American presidential history happened because Adams couldn't bear to watch his former friend, now his bitter political enemy, claim the office he was losing. The bitterness had been building for years. Adams and Jefferson had been friends during the Revolution, colleagues in Paris, partners in building the early republic. Jefferson had served as Adams's vice president, though the Constitution's original design meant the runner-up in the presidential election automatically became vice president, a system that guaranteed the administration included your political opponent. Then they'd become leaders of opposing political factions, Federalists versus Republicans, different visions of what America should become, competing ideas about federal power and foreign policy, and the very soul of the republic. The 1800 election had been vicious in ways that would make modern negative campaigns look restrained. Newspapers loyal to each side published attacks that accused opponents of atheism, monarchism, treason, sexual impropriety. Jefferson's supporters called Adams a tyrant who wanted to crown himself king. Adams's allies labeled Jefferson a dangerous radical who'd bring guillotines to America. When Jefferson won, Adams took it as both political defeat and personal betrayal. The loss wasn't just about power, it was about friendship destroyed by ideology and ambition. Adams spent his final day in office, March 3rd, doing something deliberately provocative, appointing judges. He'd already passed the Midnight Judges Act through the Federalist-controlled lame duck Congress, creating 16 new circuit court judgeships. Now he spent his final evening signing commission after commission, appointing Federalists to lifetime positions in the judiciary. It was a transparent attempt to pack the courts with his political allies, ensuring Federalist influence would survive his administration's end even as Jeffersonian Republicans took control of the executive and legislative branches. He signed commissions by lamplight in the unfinished president's house, working late into the night, determined to complete every appointment before midnight struck and his authority ended. John Marshall, whom Adams had appointed Chief Justice just 6 weeks earlier, would eventually rule on the constitutionality of these midnight appointments in Marbury v. Madison, establishing judicial review and ensuring Adams' last-minute power play would have consequences Adams himself never imagined. Abigail Adams had already left for Massachusetts weeks earlier. She couldn't stand the primitive conditions of the unfinished Capitol, couldn't stomach the political hostility, didn't want to watch her husband's humiliation. Adams spent his final weeks largely alone, isolated in an unfinished building in an incomplete city, watching his presidency collapse around him. No farewell address, no public ceremony, no gesture toward unity or reconciliation, just the midnight judicial appointments and then the pre-dawn escape. There was no letter left for Jefferson. That tradition didn't exist yet. Washington hadn't left one for Adams, so Adams owed Jefferson nothing by precedent. Besides, what would he write? Congratulations on destroying our friendship and taking my office? Best wishes in implementing policies I consider dangerous to the Republic? The two men wouldn't speak for 12 years. Their eventual reconciliation, carried out through correspondence beginning in 1812, would become one of American history's famous restored friendships. Two old revolutionaries rediscovering their bond through letters, comparing their experiences, discussing philosophy and politics with the bitterness finally faded. But in March 1801, that reconciliation was unimaginable. Adams couldn't stomach attending Jefferson's inauguration. He couldn't pretend a unity he didn't feel. So he left before dawn, his carriage wheels cutting through pre-dawn darkness, putting miles between himself and the moment when power would transfer to the man he now considered his enemy. The constitutional machinery worked anyway. Jefferson took the oath in the incomplete Capitol building, delivered his inaugural address about unity and shared principles, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," and assumed the presidency whether Adams attended or not. The Republic continued. Power transferred peacefully, if bitterly. Adams's refusal to attend didn't break the system, it just established that while power would transfer according to constitutional schedule, the outgoing president's presence was optional, a courtesy rather than a requirement. Washington had shown it could be done gracefully, with dignity and respect for institutions transcending personal feelings. Adams proved it could also be done in anger and resentment, and the Constitution would survive either way. The office was bigger than any individual's feelings about it. By the time Jefferson was sworn in at noon, Adams was miles away, traveling toward Quincy, Massachusetts, where he'd spend the next 25 years watching American politics from increasing distance, never holding office again, but maintaining his opinions in voluminous correspondence with anyone who'd engage him. His departure established a darker precedent than Washington's, that losing power could be so bitter that attending the transfer ceremony felt impossible. 3 other presidents would eventually follow Adams' example, refusing to watch their successors take the oath. The tradition of attendance would become strong enough that breaking it marked you as particularly embittered, particularly unable to accept defeat gracefully. But Adams proved it could be broken. The seal would transfer whether the previous holder watched or fled into pre-dawn darkness. 8 years later, on March 3, 1809, Thomas Jefferson spent his final day as president in the White House. They called it that now, though officially it remained the president's house, exhausted and relieved in equal measure. Unlike Adams, he would attend his successor's inauguration. Unlike Washington, he wouldn't pretend he was anything other than desperate to leave. The presidency had worn him down in ways the Revolution never had. Writing to friends that winter, he used almost the exact phrase Washington had used, being released from chains. But Jefferson's sense of imprisonment was philosophical as much as physical. 8 years of political warfare, foreign policy crises, and constitutional contradictions had taught him that principles were easier to maintain in opposition than in power. He'd entered office believing he could govern according to strict constitutional interpretation. He'd left it having purchased Louisiana without clear constitutional authority, having enforced trade embargoes that hurt his own supporters, having learned that theory and practice existed in constant tension. March 4th, 1809 arrived with the kind of ceremony that was becoming standardized, still informal by later standards, but recognizable as a presidential transition. Jefferson attended James Madison's inauguration at the Capitol, sitting through the oath and the inaugural address, maintaining the precedent Washington had established that Adams had broken. This wasn't a bitter transfer between enemies. Madison was his close friend, his chosen successor, the co-author of the political movement Jefferson had built. They'd worked together to oppose Federalist policies in the 1790s, collaborated on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, built the Republican Party together. This was the continuation of what they'd created, the Virginia dynasty maintaining power through friendship and shared ideology. Dolly Madison, who'd already been serving as Jefferson's official hostess since his wife Martha's death in 1782, Jefferson had been a widower the entire time he served as president, would continue in that role officially now. The political continuity was almost seamless, but Jefferson didn't leave immediately after the inauguration. He stayed in Washington for another week, packing his belongings, settling his affairs, and briefing Madison on the details of governance that never made it into official reports. They discussed ongoing diplomatic negotiations with Britain and France, personnel decisions, the delicate state of relations with Spain over Florida. Jefferson wanted to ensure Madison inherited not just the office, but the knowledge needed to operate it effectively. The presidential transition had become complex enough that a week of handoff was necessary. They walked through pending decisions, reviewed correspondence, discussed which diplomatic initiatives were worth continuing, and which should be quietly abandoned. By March 11, Jefferson was finally ready to depart. He loaded his carriage, or rather supervised the enslaved workers who loaded his carriage. The contradiction of the great apostle of liberty departing the White House attended by enslaved people he owned was apparently invisible to him, and began the journey south to Virginia. The trip took several days. Traveling through the countryside, Jefferson knew intimately. He'd be passing farms he'd visited, families he'd known, landscapes he'd studied for agricultural potential. Home meant something specific. Monticello, his architectural experiment on a Virginia hillside, his library, his inventions, his grandchildren. His plantation worked by enslaved laborers whose freedom he'd never seriously considered despite writing that all men are created equal. The contradictions had exhausted him. Jefferson had entered office believing he could reduce federal power and govern according to strict constitutional principles. He'd left it having expanded federal power through the Louisiana Purchase, which he'd done without clear constitutional authority because the opportunity was too good to pass up. He'd championed states' rights but had enforced federal authority when necessary. He'd believed in limited government but had created an increasingly complex federal apparatus. 8 years of those contradictions, of the gap between his political philosophy and practical governance, had left him eager to retreat to the intellectual and agricultural pursuits that didn't require such compromises. Letters he wrote during his final months as president revealed genuine relief, bordering on joy. The chains metaphor wasn't casual rhetoric. He genuinely felt trapped by the office, constrained by responsibilities that conflicted with his political philosophy and personal inclinations. At Monticello, he immediately threw himself into projects he'd been postponing for 8 years. Agricultural experiments with crop rotation and new plant varieties, architectural renovations to his perpetually unfinished house, correspondence with intellectuals across America and Europe about everything from fossils to philosophy, the organization of his library. He would never return to Washington, never hold federal office again, never particularly want to. The presidency had been an obligation, not an ambition. He'd done his duty to the republic he'd helped create. Now it was over, and he could return to the life he'd always preferred, studying, building, thinking, surrounded by books and family and enslaved workers rather than politicians and crises. Jefferson's departure restored the precedent Washington had established. Peaceful transfer, attended ceremony, dignified exit. The republic had survived its founder's retirement, then survived its second president's bitter pre-dawn flight, and now survived its third president's exhausted relief. The pattern was becoming clear. Power would transfer on schedule, whether gracefully or bitterly, whether with hope or exhaustion. The personalities changed. Their reasons for leaving varied. Their feelings about departure ranged from satisfaction to humiliation. But the constitutional machinery continued. Madison took the oath, Jefferson went home, and the young republic proved again that it could survive transitions without violence or chaos. The presidential seal had transferred between friends this time, power passing from one Virginia Republican to another, from one political philosopher to his closest ally. But the principle remained constant. The office was temporary. The person was replaceable. The system would continue. That mattered more than whether the departing president was happy or sad, graceful or bitter, relieved or resentful. March 3rd, 1817, arrived with the White House finally rebuilt after British troops had burned it 3 years earlier during the War of 1812. The scorch marks were gone, replaced by fresh white paint that gave the building its enduring nickname. James Madison spent his final day as president in the reconstructed mansion, attending to routine paperwork and final cabinet meetings with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd carried the burden of wartime leadership and was eager to set it down. The War of 1812 had been a near disaster. British forces had marched into Washington in August 1814, burned the Capitol and the President's house, sent the government fleeing into the Maryland countryside. Dolly Madison had famously rescued the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington before evacuating, cutting it from its frame as British soldiers approached. Now, 3 years later, the building stood rebuilt, freshly painted white, a symbol of the nation's survival and resilience. Madison's final reception on March 3 was hosted by Dolly, who'd served as the nation's premier hostess for 16 years, 8 as Jefferson's official hostess since Jefferson was a widower, and 8 as First Lady during Madison's presidency. She'd essentially invented the role, turning White House social events into political opportunities, using entertaining as a tool of diplomacy and faction management. The March 3 reception was more celebration than goodbye. The Virginia dynasty continuing uninterrupted, power passing from Madison to his friend James Monroe, from one Virginia Republican to another. The guests understood they'd likely see Dolly again at future receptions. She wasn't leaving Washington society, just changing her official position within it. March 4 arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures. Madison attended James Monroe's inauguration at the Capitol, sitting on the platform with other dignitaries, watching his Secretary of State become his successor. The ceremony was becoming more standardized, recognizable as what we'd now call a presidential inauguration, with crowds gathered, formal speeches, the Chief Justice administering the oath. Monroe delivered an inaugural address that emphasized national unity and the fading of old political divisions. The Federalist Party was collapsing. The Republicans had essentially won the long political war that had defined the first quarter century of the Republic. Madison sat through the ceremony with visible relief. 8 years of war, crisis management, and political battles had exhausted him. He was 65 years old and ready to return to private life. The departure itself was quiet and dignified. Madison left Washington on March 6, after several days of final business and packing. He returned to Montpelier, his Virginia plantation, where he'd spend the next 19 years in retirement. He corresponded extensively with Jefferson and Monroe about politics, philosophy, and the ongoing experiment of Republican government. He organized his papers, preparing his notes from the Constitutional Convention for eventual publication. He managed his plantation, worked by enslaved laborers whose bondage Madison, like Jefferson, found philosophically troubling, but practically indispensable. He watched American politics from increasing distance, offering advice when asked but never seeking to return to public office. His departure was unremarkable in the best possible way, routine, peaceful, exactly what a democratic transition should look like, which made it quietly revolutionary every time it happened without violence or constitutional crisis. James Monroe's final day as president, March 3, 1825, marked the end of an era. He was the last president to have fought in the Revolutionary War, the last of the Virginia dynasty that had controlled the presidency for 24 of the first 36 years of the Republic. His 8 years in office had been labeled the era of good feelings, an exaggeration, but reflecting genuine reduction in partisan conflict as the Federalist Party essentially disappeared. His final acts were routine, signing last-minute legislation, completing paperwork, the bureaucratic details of closing out an administration. Nothing dramatic, nothing controversial. March 4 arrived with another standardized inauguration ceremony. Monroe attended John Quincy Adams's swearing-in at the Capitol, sitting through the ceremony despite their complicated relationship. Adams was the son of the second president, and Monroe had served in various capacities under multiple presidents. The transfer was constitutional, peaceful, unremarkable, but Monroe left office in personal financial ruin despite having served at the highest levels of government for decades. He'd spent his own money on diplomatic expenses during his earlier service as Minister to France, Minister to Great Britain, and Secretary of State, expenses Congress had never fully reimbursed, despite repeated requests. The presidency hadn't made him wealthy, it had left him deeply in debt. He spent his final days in office requesting congressional reimbursement for presidential expenses, submitting detailed accounting of money he'd spent from his own pocket on behalf of the nation. It was humiliating, a former president essentially begging Congress for back pay. The requests would drag on for years, becoming increasingly desperate as Monroe aged and his financial situation worsened. He left Washington on March 7, returning to his Virginia plantation, Oak Hill. But financial pressure would eventually force him to sell it. He'd moved to New York City in 1830 to live with his daughter, his plantation gone, his finances exhausted. He died there on July 4, 1831, the third president to die on Independence Day, joining Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who'd both died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration they'd helped create. Monroe's death on the same date 5 years later seemed almost too symbolic, as if the founding generation was departing on a schedule arranged by Providence. The contrast between public success and private financial collapse would repeat throughout presidential history. The office was prestigious, but not particularly profitable. Men who devoted their lives to public service often ended up broke, having neglected their private business interests while serving the nation. Monroe's departure closed the Virginia dynasty. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe had held the presidency for 32 of the first 36 years. That concentration of power in one state, one region, one social class would never be repeated. The presidential seal transferred smoothly from Monroe to John Quincy Adams on March 4, 1825, but Monroe left Washington financially destroyed by his decades of public service to the Republic. John Quincy Adams became the second Adams to occupy the White House, and he'd become the second Adams to refuse attending his successor's inauguration. But first, he had to get through 4 years of one of the most contentious presidencies in early American history. His election in 1824 had been decided by the House of Representatives after no candidate won an electoral majority. Adams had actually lost both the popular vote and the electoral vote to Andrew Jackson. But when the House chose the president, Adams won through what Jackson's supporters called a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. Jackson's people claimed Adams had promised Clay the position of Secretary of State in exchange for Clay's support in the House vote. Whether true or not, Adams did make Clay his Secretary of State, and Jackson's supporters never forgave either man. March 3rd, 1829, found Adams in the White House, bitter and exhausted after 4 years of relentless political warfare. Jackson had spent 4 years attacking Adams's presidency as illegitimate, preparing for the 1828 rematch. That campaign had been vicious even by early American standards. Jackson's supporters attacked Adams as corrupt and elitist, while Adams's allies attacked Jackson's wife Rachel, dredging up old questions about the timing of her divorce and remarriage, essentially calling her an adulteress and Jackson a homewrecker. Rachel Jackson died in December 1828, shortly after Jackson's election victory. Jackson blamed Adams's political supporters for her death. The stress of the campaign attacks had, he believed, killed her. He'd never forgive them. Adams couldn't stomach attending Jackson's inauguration. The loss was bitter enough, being defeated by a man he considered unfit for office, a military hero with limited political experience, and what Adams viewed as dangerous populist instincts. But the vicious campaign, the attacks on both sides, the fundamental disagreement about what American democracy should look like, it was too much. Adams repeated his father's choice from 1801. On the morning of March 4th, 1829, he left the White House before Jackson's inauguration, departing Washington quietly for Quincy, Massachusetts. He wouldn't watch the frontier general take the oath. He'd leave before the ceremony, maintaining at least that much dignity, avoiding the humiliation of sitting through Jackson's moment of triumph. But Adams did something unprecedented. He returned to politics. Most ex-presidents retired permanently. Washington to Mount Vernon, Jefferson to Monticello, Madison to Montpelier, Monroe eventually to New York, but out of politics. Adams went home to Massachusetts, but in 1831 he was elected to the House of Representatives, becoming the only former president to serve in Congress after leaving the White House. He'd spend the next 17 years as a congressman, representing Massachusetts and increasingly fighting against slavery expansion. He'd become more radical as he aged, more willing to challenge Southern power, more committed to anti-slavery advocacy. He'd argue before the Supreme Court in the Amistad case, defending enslaved Africans who'd taken control of their ship. He'd fight the gag rule that prevented anti-slavery petitions from being discussed in Congress. On February 21st, 1848, Adams collapsed on the House floor during a debate. He'd suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. Members carried him to the speaker's room, where he lingered for 2 days, occasionally regaining consciousness. He died on February 23, still serving as congressman, still fighting his political battles. His refusal to attend Jackson's inauguration in 1829 had established the family tradition of bitter departure, both father and son fleeing rather than watching their successors' triumphs. But his return to public service showed you could leave the presidency and still matter in American politics, still contribute, still fight for what you believed in. The office didn't define you. Leaving it didn't end your political relevance if you chose to continue serving. Andrew Jackson's final day as president, March 3, 1837, came after 8 years of governance that had fundamentally changed American politics. He'd arrived in Washington in 1829 as a frontier outsider, a military hero with limited political experience, representing a new kind of democratic politics that terrified the Eastern establishment. He'd governed with an iron will that earned him the nickname King Andrew from his opponents. He defied the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, reportedly saying John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Though that quote may be apocryphal, the sentiment was accurate. He destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, vetoing its recharter and withdrawing federal deposits, triggering an economic crisis that would bloom into the Panic of 1837 shortly after he left office. He'd survived an assassination attempt in 1835, when Richard Lawrence fired 2 pistols at him at point-blank range, both misfired, and Jackson beat Lawrence with his cane. He'd overseen the forced removal of Native American tribes from the Southeast, the Trail of Tears that killed thousands. He'd been authoritarian, imperious, willing to ignore institutions that constrained him. And then he left office peacefully. That mattered. March 4th, 1837, arrived with Jackson enthusiastically attending Martin Van Buren's inauguration. Van Buren was his hand-picked successor, his vice president during his second term, his chosen heir to continue Jacksonian Democratic policies. Jackson had ensured Van Buren's nomination, used his political influence to secure Van Buren's election, and now he'd ensure Van Buren was properly installed. The inauguration was held outdoors despite cold weather, with Jackson sitting prominently on the platform. His final speech before leaving office praised Van Buren effusively, essentially blessing the succession. The message was clear. Jackson was leaving, but Jacksonian democracy would continue under his chosen successor. Jackson left Washington by railroad, one of the first ex-presidents to use this relatively new technology for his departure journey. The symbolism was fitting. The frontier general leaving by modern technology, heading back to Tennessee, but connected to the capital by the expanding rail network that was transforming America. He returned to the Hermitage, his plantation outside Nashville, where he'd spend his remaining 8 years maintaining political influence through correspondence and visitors. He'd continue to be consulted on major political decisions. Van Buren and later James K. Polk would seek his advice and blessing. He remained Old Hickory until his death in 1845, revered by supporters, hated by opponents, but undeniably influential even in retirement. The contradiction of Jackson's departure is what made it significant. Here was exactly the kind of strong leader who might have tried to hold on to power, who'd shown authoritarian tendencies throughout his presidency, who'd defied the Supreme Court and destroyed a major financial institution and removed Native Americans from their lands through forced marches. And yet when the Constitution required him to leave, he left. He attended Van Buren's inauguration enthusiastically, gave his blessing to the succession, and went home. The system Washington had established could hold even when tested by personalities who chafed against constitutional limits. The office was bigger than any individual, even one as dominating as Jackson. The presidential seal transferred to his hand-picked successor, a controlled exit, power passed to an ally, but the principle remained constant. The Constitution set the schedule, not the president's will. March 3rd, 1841, found Martin Van Buren in the White House during the aftermath of the Panic of 1837, the economic depression that had destroyed his presidency, despite not being his fault. The financial crisis had begun in Jackson's final year, triggered partly by Jackson's destruction of the Second Bank and his specie circular requiring gold or silver for federal land purchases. But Van Buren had taken office just as the crisis exploded into full panic. Banks failing, businesses collapsing, unemployment soaring. He'd spent 4 years being blamed for an economic disaster he'd inherited, unable to fix it with the limited tools available to federal government in the 1840s. His opponents called the crisis Van Buren's Depression and nicknamed ramshackle settlements Van Buren villages. The attribution was unfair, but politically devastating. His final day was routine, paperwork, final meetings, the bureaucratic details of closing out an administration. He wasn't bitter, exactly. He understood how politics worked. You got blamed for things beyond your control. That was the job. March 4 arrived cold and rainy, brutal weather for an outdoor inauguration ceremony. William Henry Harrison, the 68-year-old Whig war hero who defeated Van Buren on the slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too, insisted on giving his inaugural address without a coat or hat despite the freezing rain. Van Buren sat on the platform, watching, knowing that Harrison's age combined with this weather was a dangerous combination. The speech lasted 2 hours, the longest inaugural address in American history, over 8,400 words, delivered in freezing rain by the oldest man ever elected president, refusing to acknowledge the cold because he wanted to prove his vigor. Van Buren watched this display of dangerous bravado and maintained his composure. He'd been defeated by circumstances beyond his control, an economic depression he didn't cause, a charismatic war hero telling voters he'd fix everything with Whig economic policies. Tippecanoe had been Harrison's nickname from the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe, where he'd defeated Tecumseh's Confederation. Tyler, too, referred to John Tyler, Harrison's running mate. The campaign had been more about personalities and symbols than policy, log cabins and hard cider, portraying Harrison as a frontier Democrat despite his actually being from a wealthy Virginia family. Van Buren had been portrayed as an effete aristocrat despite actually coming from much humbler origins than Harrison. Politics had become about image rather than substance, and Van Buren had lost that image war. He attended the full ceremony despite the freezing rain, maintained dignity despite economic scapegoating, and left Washington on March 6 for Kinderhook, New York. He'd returned to politics, running again in 1844, losing the Democratic nomination, then running as the Free Soil Party candidate in 1848, opposing slavery expansion. But he'd never hold office again. His departure was graceful, accepting electoral loss without bitterness, despite the unfair blame he'd carried for 4 years. The economic depression continued regardless of who sat in the presidential chair. These crises were bigger than individual presidents, though politics always demanded someone to blame. William Henry Harrison never got to plan his departure because he died 31 days after that freezing inaugural address. By late March 1841, he'd fallen ill. The exact cause remains debated. Pneumonia was the official diagnosis, though some modern analysis suggests typhoid or another infection. What's documented is that the freezing 2-hour inaugural speech in driving rain probably didn't help. He'd been the oldest president ever inaugurated at 68, and he'd insisted on proving his vigor by refusing a coat. Harrison had spent his first weeks in office overwhelmed by office seekers. The spoils system meant every government position was political patronage, and thousands of job seekers had descended on Washington expecting the new Whig administration to reward them with appointments. Harrison had been besieged in the White House by people demanding jobs, spending hours each day receiving visitors who thought they deserved government positions. By April 3rd, Harrison was seriously ill, confined to his White House bedroom. His final 24 hours were spent unconscious or delirious, doctors attending with the medical knowledge of 1841, which meant bloodletting, opium, various ineffective treatments that probably worsened his condition rather than helping. His wife Anna had never even reached Washington. She'd stayed in Ohio, planning to join him later once the weather improved. She was still at home when her husband died. Vice President John Tyler was at his Virginia home when urgent messengers arrived on horseback, summoning him to Washington. Harrison died at 12:30 a.m. on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after his inauguration, creating a constitutional crisis because the succession rules were unclear. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the presidency if the president died, but it didn't specify whether Tyler would become president or merely acting president. Tyler arrived in Washington and immediately took the presidential oath, establishing the precedent that the vice president fully assumes the office, not just its duties. This became known as the Tyler precedent, establishing what would become standard practice. If a president dies, the vice president becomes president completely, not just a temporary placeholder. Harrison's body lay in state in the White House. The first presidential funeral, the first presidential death in office, the first constitutional succession crisis. The office had killed him within a month. His inauguration day bravado, the 2-hour speech in freezing rain, refusing a coat to prove his vigor, had contributed to his death. The presidential seal transferred via death for the first time, and the Constitution held through its first real test of succession procedures. John Tyler's presidency was contentious from the start. Many called him his accidency, refusing to accept that he was fully president rather than acting president. His own Whig party hated him. He'd vetoed Whig economic legislation repeatedly, including efforts to recreate a national bank, the very policies Harrison had presumably been elected to implement. The Whigs expelled Tyler from the party in 1841, just months into his presidency. He governed without a party for most of his term, opposed by both Whigs and Democrats, the most politically isolated president in American history. His cabinet resigned en masse in 1841 except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Tyler replaced them and continued governing, proving the presidency could function even when both political parties opposed the occupant. By March 3, 1845, Tyler was completing the most unpopular presidency to that point, accomplishing his final significant act, signing the joint resolution annexing Texas on March 1, just 3 days before leaving office. Texas annexation had been his priority. He'd negotiated the treaty, pushed it through Congress, and finally got it passed through joint resolution rather than treaty ratification. It would lead to war with Mexico within a year, but Tyler wouldn't be president to deal with that consequence. His final day was routine paperwork, preparing to hand power to James K. Polk, the Democrat who'd won partly by supporting Texas annexation. March 4 arrived with another standardized inauguration. Tyler attended Polk's ceremony despite mutual dislike, maintaining the tradition of peaceful transfer even when personally despised. Both Whigs and Democrats were happy to see him go. He left Washington for his Virginia plantation, and here's where Tyler's story takes its darkest turn. He'd later commit the only presidential treason in American history. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Tyler joined the Confederate cause enthusiastically. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives in November 1861. He died in January 1862 before taking his seat, but died under the Confederate flag, having renounced his allegiance to the Union he'd once led. The peaceful departure in 1845 gave no hint of the betrayal to come. Tyler attended Polk's inauguration, left office peacefully, and the presidential seal transferred normally. Then 16 years later, Tyler fought to destroy the republic he'd once served. James K. Polk arrived at the presidency in 1845 with a clear agenda and promised to serve only one term. He kept that promise, but the term nearly killed him. By March 3, 1849, Polk had visibly aged beyond his years. He'd worked relentlessly, expanding the nation to the Pacific through the Mexican-American War, negotiating the Oregon boundary with Britain, lowering tariffs, reforming the treasury system. He'd accomplished essentially everything he'd set out to do, but the work ethic had destroyed his health. His diary entries from early 1849 document exhaustion bordering on collapse. On his final day in office, he worked until midnight signing last-minute legislation that Congress had rushed through in the closing hours of the session. The image is almost absurd. The president working past midnight on his last day because Congress couldn't get its work done on schedule. His diary entry for March 3, 1849, reads, "I am heartily rejoiced that my term is so near its close." The relief is palpable in that sentence. 4 years of relentless work, constant political battles, managing a war, expanding the nation, and he was done. Exhausted, aged, gaunt, but done. March 4 arrived with Zachary Taylor's inauguration, old rough and ready, the Mexican war general who'd won military victories implementing Polk's expansionist policies, now succeeding him as president. Polk attended the ceremony despite visible illness, sitting through Taylor's inaugural address, maintaining the peaceful transfer tradition even though he looked like death warmed over. His wife Sarah documented his declining health through the final months. He'd lost weight, aged visibly, developed a persistent cough. They left Washington on March 6th, beginning a slow journey home to Tennessee. Polk wanted to visit the South, see friends, receive the honors he'd been too busy to accept during his presidency. But he was dying. The journey was exhausting. Receptions, speeches, crowds wanting to honor the former president. By the time they reached Nashville, Polk was seriously ill. He died on June 15th, 1849, just 103 days after leaving office, at age 53. The cause was likely cholera, though his exhaustion and weakened condition made him vulnerable. Polk had literally worked himself to death, the most exhaustive presidency to that point, the most accomplished single-term presidency, and it killed him within 3 months of leaving office. Sarah Polk would outlive him by 42 years, wearing black mourning clothes the entire time, dying in 1891 as the longest-lived First Lady. The presidential seal had transferred from Polk to Taylor, from a dying workaholic to a military hero, the presidency consuming one man while beckoning the next into its embrace. July 4th, 1850, arrived with brutal Washington summer heat, the kind of oppressive humidity that made the Capitol nearly uninhabitable before air conditioning. President Zachary Taylor attended the Washington Monument groundbreaking ceremony that afternoon, standing in the sun for hours, listening to speeches, participating in the patriotic celebration. He was 65 years old, a career military officer who'd never voted before running for president. A Mexican war hero who'd won the presidency in 1848 despite having no political experience. After the ceremony, Taylor consumed large quantities of cold milk and cherries. Accounts vary on exactly what he ate, but the combination in that heat was documented as problematic. By July 5, he was seriously ill with acute gastroenteritis. The next 4 days were agony. Taylor suffered severe stomach pain, fever, dehydration. White House doctors treated him with the standard remedies of 1850. Calomel, opium, quinine. These treatments likely worsened his condition rather than helping. Mercury poisoning adds to gastrointestinal distress. His wife Margaret was at his bedside throughout. Vice President Millard Fillmore was kept informed as the president's condition deteriorated. By July 8, Taylor was clearly dying. His final 24 hours on July 8-9 were spent largely unconscious, his body shutting down from the combination of infection, dehydration, and toxic medical treatments. He died at 10:35 p.m. on July 9, 1850, the second president to die in office, just 16 months into his term. Taylor's death came at a critical moment. The Compromise of 1850 was being debated in Congress, a package of bills designed to address the sectional crisis over slavery expansion into territories gained from Mexico. Taylor had been prepared to oppose key provisions, particularly the Fugitive Slave Act that would require northern states to return escaped slaves. His death removed that obstacle. Fillmore was sworn in on July 10 and would sign the compromise Taylor had opposed, fundamentally changing the course of American history. The presidential seal transferred via death at precisely the moment when that transfer altered the slavery debate. Taylor's body lay in state with military honors, another presidential funeral, another constitutional succession, another vice president assuming office through death rather than election. Millard Fillmore spent his final day as president, March 3, 1853, knowing his presidency would be defined by one controversial decision, signing the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850. He'd succeeded Taylor and immediately faced the sectional crisis his predecessor had been preparing to handle differently. Fillmore chose compromise over confrontation, signing legislation that required northern states to cooperate in returning escaped slaves to southern owners. It was his attempt to preserve the Union by giving the South what it demanded, but it outraged northern abolitionists and made Fillmore politically toxic in his own party. His final acts were routine paperwork, preparing for transition during a worsening sectional crisis that compromise had only temporarily papered over. March 4th, 1853, arrived with freezing weather. Brutal cold rain, temperatures barely above freezing. Fillmore attended Franklin Pierce's inauguration despite the conditions, sitting on the outdoor platform in the cold. His wife Abigail stood beside him throughout the ceremony, wearing inadequate clothing for the weather, determined to fulfill her duties as First Lady through the final moments. The ceremony lasted hours in freezing rain. Abigail developed a severe cold that day that quickly progressed to pneumonia. She died on March 30th, 1853, just 26 days after leaving the White House. The inauguration attendance killed her. Fillmore left office quietly as the sectional crisis worsened, his compromise having bought perhaps 3 years of uneasy peace. He'd later run as the Know-Nothing Party candidate in 1856, embracing anti-immigrant nativist politics in his post-presidential career, carrying only Maryland in a humiliating loss. His peaceful departure was constitutionally normal, but his wife paid the ultimate cost for attending his successor's ceremony in freezing rain. The presidential seal transferred normally, but Fillmore would spend the rest of his life knowing that attending Pierce's inauguration had killed Abigail. Franklin Pierce arrived at the presidency already psychologically destroyed. His 11-year-old son Benjamin had been killed in a train accident on January 6, 1853, just 2 months before Pierce's inauguration. Pierce and his wife Jane had watched their son die in front of them. The train car had derailed, and Benjamin was killed almost instantly. Jane believed it was God's punishment for Pierce's political ambitions. She never recovered from the loss, refused most public duties, wore black throughout the entire presidency, turned the White House into a mausoleum of grief. Pierce's drinking, already problematic, became severe, documented by White House staff who witnessed his alcoholism throughout his term. By March 3, 1857, Pierce was relieved to escape a presidency that had been torture from the start. His support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed territories to decide slavery through popular sovereignty, had led to Bleeding Kansas, armed conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. His presidency was considered a failure even before it ended. He attended James Buchanan's inauguration on March 4, grateful to pass the burden to his close friend. Buchanan was a lifelong bachelor. Pierce handed him a republic collapsing towards civil war while grieving a dead son and managing a wife who'd never forgiven him for entering politics. Pierce left Washington immediately, traveled to Europe trying to outrun his grief, and became the only president denied renomination by his own party. Democrats chose Buchanan in 1856 rather than give Pierce a second term. His drinking continued after leaving office. He supported the Confederacy during the Civil War, making pro-Southern speeches in the North that made him widely hated. He died in 1869, alcoholic and despised. His presidency remembered as one of the worst. The presidential seal transferred from a broken man to a bachelor who'd inherit complete national collapse. Grief passing to someone about to face catastrophe. James Buchanan's final day in the White House, March 3, 1861, came with 7 states already seceded from the Union and Fort Sumter under Confederate siege. His presidency had been a 4-year collapse towards civil war, and Buchanan's response had been paralysis. He believed states had no constitutional right to secede, but also believed the federal government had no constitutional right to prevent secession by force. This logical trap left him doing essentially nothing while the Union fractured. His final cabinet meeting on March 3 couldn't solve the crisis he'd failed to address throughout his presidency. March 4, 1861, arrived with Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, the last gesture of normalcy before war. Buchanan attended the ceremony, rode to the Capitol with Lincoln, participated in the peaceful transfer of power even as the nation was literally dividing. He reportedly told Lincoln, "If you are as happy entering as I am leaving, You are happy indeed. It was one of the few honest statements about his failed presidency. 7 states had formed the Confederate States of America on February 4th, electing Jefferson Davis as their president on February 9. Buchanan was handing Lincoln a constitutional crisis with no good options. Fort Sumter would fall on April 13, beginning the Civil War that would kill 620,000 Americans over 4 years. Buchanan left Washington immediately for Pennsylvania, escaping the collapsing Union he'd been unable to hold together. He'd spend his remaining years, until his death in 1868, defending his inaction, writing a memoir justifying his decisions, insisting he'd been right to avoid confrontation. Historians would judge him harshly, consistently ranked among the worst presidents, blamed for failing to prevent what might have been preventable, for choosing inaction when action was desperately needed. His niece Harriet Lane had served as White House hostess since Buchanan was a lifelong bachelor. He attended Lincoln's inauguration, left Washington, and watched from Pennsylvania as the nation he'd failed to preserve tore itself apart. The presidential seal transferred as the Union fractured, power without union, authority without a country intact to govern, constitutional succession occurring while the Constitution itself was being rejected by 7 states. April 14, 1865, began with Abraham Lincoln attending a cabinet meeting to discuss Reconstruction. 5 days earlier, Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. The Union was preserved, slavery would be abolished through the 13th Amendment, and Lincoln was already planning the difficult work of reunifying the nation. That evening, he attended Ford's Theater with his wife Mary for a performance of Our American Cousin. The president sat in the state box with Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. At 10:13 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a .44 caliber Derringer. Booth shouted Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tire, and jumped to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, then escaped into the night. Lincoln was carried unconscious across the street to the Peterson House, a boarding house, where he was laid diagonally on a bed too short for his tall frame. Doctors examined him throughout the night, but could do nothing. The bullet had penetrated his brain. Mary Todd Lincoln was hysterical with grief. Cabinet members gathered. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton coordinated the response and manhunt for Booth. Lincoln never regained consciousness. At 7:22 and on April 15, he died. Stanton reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Vice President Andrew Johnson was summoned and sworn in that morning. Booth was tracked down and killed on April 26. His co-conspirators were hanged. Lincoln's body lay in state in the White House, then traveled by funeral train to Springfield, Illinois, stopping in cities along the way for public mourning. He'd been killed during a celebration of victory, assassinated just as the war he'd guided to conclusion was ending. The presidential seal transferred via murder, the first assassination, and Reconstruction would now be managed by Johnson, whose approach differed dramatically from what Lincoln had planned. Andrew Johnson's presidency was contentious from the moment he took the oath. As a Southern Democrat who'd remained loyal to the Union, he'd been added to Lincoln's 1864 ticket to demonstrate unity. But his Reconstruction policies favored rapid restoration of Southern states, with minimal requirements for protecting freed slaves' rights. Radical Republicans in Congress opposed him, passed Reconstruction Acts over his vetoes, and ultimately impeached him in 1868. The charges centered on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The Senate voted 35-19 to convict, 1 vote short of the 36 needed to remove him from office. By March 3, 1869, Johnson had survived impeachment, but his presidency was destroyed. His relationship with Ulysses S. Grant, his successor, had deteriorated from ally to enemy. Grant had initially supported Johnson, but gradually moved toward the radical Republicans. On March 4, Johnson refused to attend Grant's inauguration, becoming the 3rd president to skip his successor's oath. Like both Adamses before him, Johnson couldn't stomach watching a man he now considered his enemy assume the office. He left the White House before the ceremony, while Grant took the oath without him. Johnson returned to Tennessee, but unlike most ex-presidents, he returned to politics. In 1875, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, becoming the only former president to serve there. He died 4 months later, in July 1875. His departure established that even impeached presidents who barely survived removal could leave peacefully, if bitterly. The presidential seal transferred while the impeached president fled, constitutional succession occurring despite the political chaos. Ulysses S. Grant's final day as president, March 3, 1877, came after 8 years marked by scandals throughout his administration. Grant himself remained personally honest but politically naive, surrounding himself with corrupt allies who exploited their positions. The whiskey ring scandal involved federal officials conspiring with distillers to avoid taxes. The Credit Mobilier scandal involved railroad corruption reaching Congress. Multiple cabinet members resigned in disgrace. Grant's presidency was defined by corruption he failed to prevent or address effectively. Despite the scandals, Grant remained personally popular. His final acts were routine, pardons, paperwork, preparing for Rutherford B. Hayes' inauguration. March 4, 1877, arrived with another disputed election. Hayes had been awarded the presidency by an electoral commission after the contested 1876 election required congressional intervention. Grant attended Hayes' inauguration gracefully, maintaining the peaceful transfer tradition. His wife Julia Grant cried while leaving the White House, reluctant to give up her position and social status. Grant left for a 2-year world tour, documented extensively in newspapers. He was received by heads of state across Europe and Asia as a conquering Union general and former president, but he'd later go bankrupt in 1884 through a financial scheme, losing everything. Diagnosed with throat cancer, he spent his final year racing to complete his memoirs so his family wouldn't be left destitute. Mark Twain published those memoirs, which became a bestseller. Grant died in 1885, just days after finishing the manuscript. His graceful departure contrasted sharply with the scandals that defined his administration. Personally honorable, politically disastrous, financially ruined, despite having been president. Rutherford B. Hayes' final day as president, March 3, 1881, came after a presidency whose legitimacy was questioned from the beginning. The 1876 election had been so disputed that Congress created an electoral commission to resolve it. Hayes won by a single electoral vote through the Compromise of 1877. He'd get the presidency in exchange for ending Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the South. Democrats called him his fraudulency for 4 years, refusing to accept his legitimacy. The disputed election had left deep scars. 20 electoral votes from 4 states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, had been contested, with both parties submitting competing slates of electors. The Electoral Commission, composed of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, voted along party lines to award all disputed votes to Hayes, giving him a 185-184 electoral victory, despite losing the popular vote to Samuel Tilden by over 250,000 votes. Southern Democrats accepted this outcome only because of the compromise. Hayes would become president, but Reconstruction would end, federal troops would withdraw, and white Democratic governments would take control of the South. Hayes had promised to serve only 1 term and kept that promise. His final acts were routine. No controversy. March 4, 1881, arrived with James Garfield's inauguration. Hayes attended gracefully, maintaining peaceful transfer despite having his legitimacy questioned throughout his presidency. His wife Lucy, nicknamed Lemonade Lucy for banning alcohol from the White House, presided over a temperance-focused social scene. Hayes left Washington relieved, returning to Ohio where he'd spend 19 years in quiet retirement focused on humanitarian causes, particularly education and prison reform. His voluntary 1-term presidency restored some dignity to an office he'd assumed under controversial circumstances. The Compromise of 1877 had ended Reconstruction, allowing Southern Democrats to regain control and begin implementing Jim Crow laws that would oppress Black Americans for the next century. Hayes's presidency was thus a success in terms of preserving his personal dignity, but a failure in terms of protecting the rights of freed slaves. The presidential seal transferred from a disputed president to the next, constitutional process maintained even when legitimacy was questioned. July 2nd, 1881, found James Garfield at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, preparing to leave for a summer trip to New Jersey. He'd been president for just 4 months, still settling into the office, still dealing with the endless parade of office seekers demanding government jobs under the spoils system. The station was crowded that Saturday morning. Travelers, porters, vendors, the usual chaos of a busy railroad depot in summer heat. Garfield arrived with Secretary of State James G. Blaine walking through the ladies' waiting room on their way to the platform. His wife Lucretia was already in New Jersey, recovering from malaria at a seaside resort. Garfield planned to join her, then continue to Massachusetts for his 25th college reunion at Williams College. Charles Guiteau had been stalking Garfield for weeks. He was a failed lawyer, failed insurance salesman, failed evangelist, a man who drifted through life leaving debts and broken promises. He'd written a rambling campaign speech supporting Garfield in 1880, convinced himself it had been crucial to the election victory, and decided he deserved a diplomatic appointment as reward. He'd pestered the White House and State Department for months, demanding to be made consul to Paris despite having no qualifications, no diplomatic experience, no foreign language skills. When Garfield's administration finally told him to stop coming around, Guiteau convinced himself that Garfield was ruining the Republican Party, and God wanted him removed. He bought a .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver, choosing one with an ivory handle because he thought it would look good in a museum after his famous deed. At 9:30 a.m., Guiteau approached Garfield in the waiting room. The president was walking with Blaine, engaged in conversation, unguarded. There was no Secret Service protection for presidents yet. That wouldn't come until after McKinley's assassination 20 years later. Guiteau stepped close and fired twice. The first bullet grazed Garfield's arm. The second struck him in the back, lodged near his spine, and changed American history. Garfield fell, conscious but in shock. Guiteau tried to leave, but was grabbed by a police officer who happened to be nearby. As he was arrested, Guiteau announced, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. Arthur is president now," referring to the Republican faction led by Roscoe Conkling and implying Vice President Chester Arthur would now take office. Garfield didn't die immediately. He survived for 80 days in what became a summer of national agony and medical incompetence. Doctors probed the wound with their fingers and unsterilized instruments, trying to locate the bullet. This was 1881. Germ theory existed but wasn't universally accepted by American doctors. Joseph Lister had pioneered antiseptic surgery in Britain, but many American physicians still thought antisepsis was unnecessary fussing. Garfield's doctors poked and probed with contaminated hands and instruments, introducing infection deep into the wound cavity. The bullet itself probably wasn't fatal. Modern analysis suggests Garfield could have survived with the bullet left in place. But the medical treatment was killing him. Alexander Graham Bell heard about the president's condition and thought his new invention could help. He'd been working on a metal detector device, an electromagnetic induction balance that could locate metal objects. He brought it to the White House in early August and swept it over Garfield's torso, trying to find the bullet. The device kept giving confusing signals. Bell tried repeatedly, adjusting the sensitivity, changing positions. Years later, someone realized the problem. Garfield was lying on a bed with metal springs, something uncommon in 1881. The metal springs were creating false readings, making it impossible to locate the bullet. Bell's invention actually worked. It just couldn't overcome the interference from the presidential bed. By late August, Garfield's condition was deteriorating. He'd lost massive amounts of weight, was running fevers, clearly suffering from infection. Doctors decided to move him to the New Jersey shore, hoping the cooler ocean air would help. A special rail line was built overnight to bring the train closer to the cottage in Elberon. Garfield was transported on September 6, placed in a seaside residence, positioned so he could see the ocean from his bed. Lucretia was with him constantly, nursing him despite her own recent illness. For a few days, he seemed slightly better. The cooler air, the break from Washington's oppressive summer heat and humidity, but the infection was too advanced. Modern analysis of contemporary medical reports suggests Garfield had developed massive abscesses and septicemia, blood poisoning from the bacterial infection introduced by the doctor's probing. By September 18, his heart was failing under the strain. His final 24 hours on September 18-19 were marked by heart failure and systemic collapse, the infection overwhelming his weakened body. He died at 10:35 p.m. on September 19, 1881, 11 weeks after being shot. He'd been conscious and coherent through much of his ordeal, dictating letters, conducting some business, suffering with remarkable stoicism. Modern medical analysis suggests the doctor's unsanitary probing killed him as much as the assassin's bullet. Perhaps more. The bullet created the wound, but the doctors turned it into a fatal infection through their pre-antiseptic treatment. Vice President Chester Arthur was sworn in at 2:15 a.m. on September 20. Garfield's assassination led directly to civil service reform. The Pendleton Act of 1883 created merit-based federal employment rather than the patronage system that had motivated Guiteau. The presidential seal transferred via slow death 80 days of constitutional limbo while nobody was entirely sure who was running the government. Arthur's ascension to the presidency was greeted with horror by reformers who knew his background. He'd been collector of the Port of New York, a position that controlled thousands of patronage jobs and was notoriously corrupt. He'd been part of Roscoe Conkling's Republican political machine, the quintessential spoilsman who'd built his career on the patronage system. President Rutherford Hayes had actually fired Arthur from the collector position in 1878 for running it as a political machine rather than a professional customs operation. Now this machine politician was president, and reformers assumed the worst. But Arthur surprised everyone. He understood that Garfield had been killed by the spoils system, by a man who believed he deserved a government job as political reward, and had been driven mad when denied. Arthur couldn't ignore that his presidency existed because the patronage system had produced an assassin. He supported civil service reform, even though it meant dismantling the system that had built his own career. When the Pendleton Act reached his desk in January 1883, creating a merit-based civil service commission and protecting federal workers from being fired for political reasons, Arthur signed it. The machine politician became the reform president, understanding that the assassination had made reform inevitable and necessary. His presidency was marked by unexpected elegance and competence. Arthur renovated the White House extensively, bringing in Louis Comfort Tiffany to redesign the interior, hosting elaborate dinners with fine wines and gourmet food. He was a widower. His wife Ellen had died in January 1880, before he became vice president, and his sister Mary served as White House hostess. He became known for his fashionable clothing, his refined tastes, his late-night habits. He rarely appeared at the office before 10 a.m., worked until late afternoon, then spent evenings dining and socializing. He was perhaps the most elegant president since the Virginia aristocrats, a strange contrast to his machine politician background. But he was dying the entire time. Bright's disease, a then incurable kidney condition, was slowly killing him throughout his presidency. He kept it secret from the public and even from most of his associates. Only his closest friends and doctors knew. He experienced fatigue, declining health, increasing weakness, but maintained his public schedule and elegant entertaining as much as possible. By 1884, when the Republican convention met to choose a nominee, Arthur's health had deteriorated significantly. He wanted the nomination for a full term. He was the sitting president. He'd governed competently. He'd surprised critics with his reform efforts. But the party nominated James G. Blaine instead, partly because Arthur had alienated his old machine politician allies through reform, partly because rumors of his declining health had circulated despite official denials. The rejection stung, but Arthur maintained dignity. He supported Blaine in the general election, even though Blaine lost to Democrat Grover Cleveland, the first Democratic president since before the Civil War. Arthur prepared for transition, knowing his presidency would be brief, knowing his life would be brief, keeping his terminal illness secret even as he arranged the peaceful transfer of power to a Democrat. His transformation from machine politician to reform president, his unexpected elegance and competence, his dignified handling of Garfield's assassination legacy, all of it was accomplished while dying, while keeping that death secret from a nation that had no idea their president was terminally ill. Chester Arthur's final day as president, March 3, 1885, came while he was secretly dying of Bright's disease, a fatal kidney condition. He'd concealed his illness throughout his presidency. The public didn't know their president was terminally ill. Arthur had been a surprise as president, governing more honestly than anyone expected from a former machine politician who'd been part of the corrupt New York political system. His final acts included signing bills and destroying personal papers. He spent his last day burning correspondence he didn't want preserved, eliminating any record of decisions or reasoning he wanted kept private. March 4, 1885, arrived with Grover Cleveland's inauguration. Arthur attended despite his illness, maintaining the peaceful transfer tradition even while dying. He was elegant and dignified, giving no public indication of his condition. 18 months later, on November 18, 1886, he died at age 57. He'd left office dying, and nobody knew. The presidential seal transferred from a secretly dying man to a Democrat, the first Democratic president since Buchanan before the Civil War. Grover Cleveland's first departure on March 3, 1889, came after losing the Electoral College despite winning the popular vote, a pattern that would repeat in American history. His wife Frances famously told White House staff, "We'll be back in 4 years." She was 24 years old, the youngest First Lady in history, and apparently confident about their return. March 4 arrived with Benjamin Harrison's inauguration, the grandson of William Henry Harrison taking the office Cleveland had lost. Cleveland attended gracefully, watching the grandson of the 9th president become the 23rd president. He left for New York to practice law, but Frances's prediction would prove correct. Cleveland would return as the 24th president in 1893, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. His first departure was temporary, though he didn't know for certain. The presidential seal transferred temporarily, an unprecedented interruption. Benjamin Harrison's final day as president, March 3, 1893, came while he was still grieving his wife Caroline, who died in October 1892 during the campaign. He'd campaigned minimally while caring for his dying wife, essentially conceding the election to focus on Caroline as tuberculosis killed her. The campaign happened around him while he watched his wife die in the White House. March 4 arrived with the unprecedented situation of handing office back to Grover Cleveland, the man Harrison had defeated 4 years earlier. Frances Cleveland returned to the White House exactly as she'd predicted, still young at 28. Harrison attended the inauguration despite his grief, maintained constitutional tradition, then left for Indianapolis. Personal tragedy had overshadowed political loss. The presidential seal returned to its previous holder, the only time in American history the same person reclaimed the office after an interruption. Grover Cleveland's second and final departure on March 3, 1897, came after a disastrous second term. The Panic of 1893 had triggered severe economic depression, bank failures, business collapses, massive unemployment. Cleveland's response had been orthodox economics that made things worse. The Pullman strike of 1894 was violently suppressed with federal troops. His second term proved that political comebacks don't always work. March 4 arrived with William McKinley's inauguration, ending Cleveland's unique position as the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. He attended the ceremony, then left for Princeton, New Jersey. He'd proved you could return to the presidency, but also that returning didn't guarantee success. He died in 1908, having spent his final years in quiet retirement. The presidential seal transferred for the second time from the same man, ending the only interrupted presidency in American history. September 6, 1901, found William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, attending a public reception and shaking hands with visitors. He'd won re-election in 1900, defeating William Jennings Bryan again, and was at the height of his popularity. The Spanish-American War in 1898 had made America a colonial power with territories in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. McKinley stood in the Temple of Music at 4:07 p.m., shaking hands in a receiving line, when Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist who believed McKinley represented oppression, approached with a gun hidden under a handkerchief. Czolgosz fired twice at point-blank range. One bullet was removed immediately, but the second lodged deeper and couldn't be located. McKinley seemed to recover initially. Doctors were optimistic. The president was conscious and alert. But over the next week, gangrene set in around the bullet wound. By September 13, his condition had deteriorated catastrophically. His final 24 hours were spent drifting in and out of consciousness at a friend's home in Buffalo. His wife Ida, who suffered from epilepsy, was at his bedside. His documented last words were, "It is God's way. His will be done." He died at 2:15 a.m. on September 14, 1901. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was in the Adirondacks when word reached him. He traveled urgently to Buffalo and was sworn in that afternoon. McKinley's assassination, the third presidential murder, brought the energetic Roosevelt to power and changed the direction of American politics. The progressive era began not through election, but through an anarchist bullet. Theodore Roosevelt's departure on March 3, 1909, came from a man who didn't want to leave. He was only 50 years old, still energetic, still ambitious, having transformed the presidency during 7.5 years in office. He'd busted trusts, built the Panama Canal, expanded federal regulation, made the presidency the center of American politics. He'd handpicked William Howard Taft as his successor, personally ensuring Taft's nomination and election. March 4 arrived with Roosevelt enthusiastically attending Taft's inauguration, confident his chosen heir would continue progressive policies. Roosevelt left immediately for a year-long African safari, documented extensively in magazines. But he couldn't stay retired. By 1912, believing Taft had betrayed progressive ideals, Roosevelt ran third party as the Bull Moose candidate, splitting the Republican vote and handing the presidency to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. His inability to accept that his time was over destroyed his friendship with Taft and damaged the Republican Party. His energetic departure in 1909 turned bitter as he watched Taft govern differently than expected. The presidential seal transferred from Roosevelt to his hand-picked successor, but Roosevelt would spend the next 3 years undermining Taft before finally accepting permanent political retirement after his. William Howard Taft's final day as president, March 3, 1913, came after Theodore Roosevelt had destroyed his presidency. Taft had never really wanted to be president. He'd been pressured into it by his wife Helen and by Roosevelt, who'd seen him as a loyal successor. His dream job was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. When Roosevelt turned on him in 1912, running third party and calling Taft a traitor to progressivism, it split the Republican vote. Taft lost badly to Woodrow Wilson, coming in third behind both Wilson and Roosevelt. March 4 arrived with Taft relieved to leave. He attended Wilson's inauguration gracefully despite Roosevelt's betrayal, maintained constitutional tradition, then left Washington. But the story has a happy ending. In 1921, President Warren Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice. Taft served until 1930, finding far more satisfaction on the court than he'd ever found as president. He's the only person to have served as both president and Chief Justice. He lost the job he never wanted, but gained the job he'd always dreamed of having. The presidential seal transferred peacefully from Taft to Wilson. Taft happier in defeat than he'd been in victory. Woodrow Wilson's final day as president, March 3, 1921, came while he was partially paralyzed from a severe stroke suffered in October 1919. For the final 18 months of his presidency, his wife Edith had functionally run the government, controlling access to the president, making decisions while claiming to merely convey his wishes. The extent of Wilson's incapacity wasn't publicly known. Cabinet members suspected but couldn't confirm. The country was essentially governed by the First Lady, an unprecedented situation that exposed massive gaps in constitutional succession planning. March 4, 1921, arrived with Wilson physically unable to walk up the Capitol steps. He rode with Warren Harding to the Capitol, but waited in a room while Harding took the oath outside. Wilson couldn't attend the ceremony, but maintained the appearance of peaceful transfer. His stroke had left him partially paralyzed on his left side, cognitively impaired, emotionally unstable. He left Washington for a house on S Street, where he'd die in 1924, bitter about the Senate's rejection of the League of Nations Treaty. The presidential seal transferred from a man who couldn't walk, whose wife had secretly governed, to Harding, who'd bring his own scandals to the office. Warren Harding's final hours came unexpectedly in San Francisco during his Voyage of Understanding tour in August 1923. He'd been traveling to connect with Americans, giving speeches, appearing at public events. On August 1, he fell ill with what appeared to be food poisoning. By August 2nd, he was in his room at the Palace Hotel when he suffered either a heart attack or stroke. The exact cause was never determined, because his wife Florence refused to allow an autopsy. He died at 7:35 p.m. on August 2, 1923, with Florence at his bedside. Vice President Calvin Coolidge was in Vermont visiting his father when word arrived after midnight. Coolidge was sworn in by his father, a notary public, at 2:47 and by oil lamp in the family farmhouse. One of the most rustic and iconic presidential swearing in ceremonies. Harding died before the full extent of his administration's scandals became public. The Teapot Dome scandal, involving Interior Secretary Albert Fall taking bribes to lease federal oil reserves, would erupt in the months after his death. Multiple other scandals involving corruption and graft would follow. Harding was lucky in a dark way. He died before facing the consequences of having appointed corrupt friends to powerful positions. The presidential seal transferred from corruption to Silent Cal, from scandal to New England rectitude. March 3, 1929, found Calvin Coolidge in the White House after choosing not to seek re-election. He'd announced in August 1927, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. The cryptic statement left people guessing whether he meant it, but he did. Silent Cal had governed with minimal effort, speaking little, working little, napping daily, yet remained popular by staying out of the way during the economic boom. The stock market was soaring, prosperity seemed endless, and Coolidge was leaving at what appeared to be the perfect moment. His governing philosophy was essentially inaction. The less government did, the better. He slept 10 to 11 hours a night, napped most afternoons, held brief cabinet meetings, and rarely initiated policy. His taciturn nature became legendary. A possibly apocryphal story claimed a dinner guest bet she could get him to say more than 2 words. Coolidge reportedly replied, "You lose," and said nothing else. Whether true or not, the story captured how Americans saw him, a man of few words who let prosperity speak for itself. The economic boom of the 1920s, the roaring 20s with its automobiles, radios, consumer goods, and soaring stock prices, made his minimal governance seem wise rather than lazy. But beneath the public image of contented retirement planning was personal tragedy. His son Calvin Jr. had died in July 1924, just months into Coolidge's elected term. The 16-year-old had developed a blister playing tennis on the White House courts. The blister became infected, blood poisoning set in before antibiotics existed to treat it, and Calvin Jr. died within a week. Coolidge was devastated. He later wrote in his autobiography, "When he went, The power and the glory of the presidency went with him. The White House became a place of grief rather than joy. Grace Coolidge, his wife, struggled with depression. Coolidge himself lost much of his enthusiasm for the presidency, going through the motions but finding little satisfaction in the office. His decision not to run in 1928 was partly about that grief, partly about fatigue, partly about believing 6 years was enough. His final months in office were spent in characteristic minimalism, routine work, brief meetings, long naps. The Republican Party nominated Herbert Hoover, his Secretary of Commerce, who won easily against Democrat Al Smith. Coolidge maintained cordial relations with Hoover, but wasn't particularly close to him. He attended final cabinet meetings, signed routine legislation, prepared for departure with the same understated efficiency he'd brought to governing. March 4 arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures. Coolidge attended Hoover's inauguration at the Capitol, sitting quietly through the ceremony, speaking little even on this ceremonial occasion. He maintained the peaceful transfer tradition without fanfare, consistent with his entire presidency. The ceremony was standard, unremarkable, routine, exactly how Coolidge preferred things. After Hoover took the oath, Coolidge left Washington immediately, taking the train back to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he and Grace would live in the modest two-family house they'd rented before his presidency. He'd bought it in 1930, finally owning a home after a lifetime of renting. The timing of his departure would prove extraordinarily fortunate. The stock market continued its upward climb through the summer of 1929. The Dow Jones Industrial Average peaked in September, reaching heights that seemed to justify the endless optimism. Then in October, the market crashed. Black Thursday, October 24, and Black Tuesday, October 29, saw panic selling, collapsing prices, fortunes evaporating. The crash triggered the Great Depression that would define the 1930s and destroy Hoover's presidency. Coolidge had left office just 8 months before the disaster, avoiding being president when the boom economy he'd presided over collapsed catastrophically. In retirement in Northampton, Coolidge wrote a syndicated newspaper column, published his autobiography, and maintained studied silence about politics. He watched the Depression unfold, watched Hoover struggle with economic collapse, and reportedly felt some guilt about the policies, or lack of policies, that had allowed the speculative bubble to grow unchecked. He died suddenly in January 1933 of a heart attack, just before Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration. He was 60 years old, having spent less than 4 years in retirement. His final years were quiet, almost obscure, the silent cal of his presidency becoming the forgotten ex-president of the Depression era. His departure in March 1929 appeared perfectly timed, leaving during prosperity, avoiding the crash. But history would question whether his hands-off approach had helped create the conditions for collapse, whether his refusal to regulate speculation or address income inequality had built the bubble that burst 8 months after he left. He'd governed by not governing, remained popular by staying invisible, and left office just before the consequences of minimal government became catastrophically apparent. The presidential seal transferred during false prosperity, from a president who believed in doing nothing to a president who'd try orthodox responses to unprecedented crisis, both approaches failing to prevent or solve the depression that was already forming beneath the surface prosperity of 1929. March 4 arrived with Herbert Hoover's inauguration. Coolidge attended quietly, maintaining peaceful transfer without fanfare, consistent with his minimalist governing style. He left Washington immediately for Massachusetts. The stock market would crash in October 1929, just 8 months after he departed, triggering the Great Depression. Coolidge's timing was extraordinarily lucky. He avoided being president when the boom economy he'd presided over collapsed catastrophically. He'd later say he was glad to have left when he did. His son Calvin Jr. had died in 1924 from blood poisoning after developing a blister while playing tennis on the White House courts, The tragedy had removed much of Coolidge's enthusiasm for political life. His silent departure was perfectly timed to avoid historical blame for the coming disaster. Herbert Hoover's final day as president, March 3, 1933, came during the worst economic crisis in American history. The Great Depression had been raging for over 3 years. Unemployment at 25%, banks failing daily, breadlines in every city, Hoovervilles of homeless encampments named mockingly after him. His policies had failed to stem the collapse. He'd tried orthodox responses, balancing budgets, maintaining gold standard when radical intervention was needed. By March 1933, the banking system was in complete collapse, with states declaring bank holidays to prevent runs. March 4 arrived with Franklin D. Roosevelt's inauguration. Hoover rode to the Capitol with F. Dieter, their relationship documented as cold and hostile. They barely spoke during the ride. Hoover attended Roosevelt's oath, sitting through F. Dieter's famous "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself" inaugural address, humiliated by defeat and blamed for a crisis he hadn't caused and couldn't solve with the tools he believed in. He left Washington as the most hated president in decades, scapegoat for economic forces beyond any individual's control. Hoover would live another 31 years, the longest post-presidency in history until Jimmy Carter. He slowly rehabilitated his reputation through humanitarian work and writing, reminding Americans of his relief work after World War I. But in March 1933, he left office despised, watching Roosevelt assume power with a mandate to completely remake the relationship between government and economy. The presidential seal transferred during national collapse, from failed orthodoxy to experimental transformation. Franklin D. Roosevelt's final hours came suddenly on April 12, 1945, at Warm Springs, Georgia, where he'd gone to rest. He'd served 12 years, the longest presidency in American history, breaking Washington's 2-term precedent. He was exhausted, visibly declining, the job and war having aged him catastrophically. That afternoon he sat for a portrait when he suddenly said, "I have a terrific headache." Those were his last words. He collapsed at 1:15 p.m. from a cerebral hemorrhage and died at 3:35 p.m. Lucy Mercer Rutherford was present, his mistress, with whom he'd resumed an affair years after Eleanor had discovered it in 1918. Lucy left quickly before Eleanor could arrive from Washington. Vice President Harry Truman knew almost nothing about Roosevelt's plans. He'd been deliberately kept out of major decisions, didn't even know about the atomic bomb project. Truman was summoned to the White House and sworn in at 7:09 p.m. Germany would surrender 26 days later on May 8. Japan would surrender in August after Truman authorized using atomic weapons Roosevelt had initiated. Efter died weeks before seeing the victory he'd engineered, with his mistress rather than his wife, passing power to a man he'd barely consulted. The presidential seal transferred via death from a giant to an unknown. Harry S. Truman's final day as president, January 19, 1953, came after 7 years and 9 months in office. He'd succeeded Roosevelt in April 1945, won election in his own right in 1948's famous upset over Thomas Dewey, and made some of history's most consequential decisions, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, implementing the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, establishing NATO, fighting the Korean War. His approval rating stood at 22%, deeply unpopular despite achievements history would later vindicate. His final day was spent completing transition briefings for Dwight Eisenhower, the war hero who defeated Democrat Adlai Stevenson in a landslide. The relationship between Truman and Eisenhower had soured considerably during the campaign. Truman had hoped Eisenhower might run as a Democrat. He'd even offered to step aside for Ike in 1948. But Eisenhower chose the Republican Party, and the 1952 campaign became bitter. Eisenhower hadn't defended Truman against Republican attacks, particularly Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations that the Truman administration was soft on communism. Truman took this as personal betrayal from a man he'd promoted and supported throughout the war. The Korean War was still raging. The conflict that had destroyed Truman's popularity was unresolved. would remain unresolved through Eisenhower's first term, finally ending in armistice in July 1953. American troops were still dying on frozen hillsides in Korea while Truman packed to leave office. The war had begun in June 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. Truman had committed American forces without congressional declaration of war, calling it a police action under UN auspices. By 1953, over 36,000 Americans had died with no clear victory in sight. The stalemate, the casualties, the firing of General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951, after MacArthur publicly challenged Truman's strategy, all of it had made Truman toxic politically. His final evening in the White House was spent quietly with his wife Bess and daughter Margaret. Bess had never liked Washington, had never wanted to be First Lady, was eager to return to Independence, Missouri. Margaret had pursued a singing career despite critics who questioned whether her talent justified the attention she received as the president's daughter. Truman had famously written an angry letter to a music critic who'd given Margaret a negative review. "I have just read your lousy review. You sound like a frustrated old man who never made a success." A letter that became public and showed Truman's fierce loyalty to family even when politically unwise. January 20th, 1953, arrived cold and clear. Truman attended Eisenhower's inauguration at the Capitol, though the warmth between them was gone. They rode together to the ceremony in awkward silence. Two men who'd worked together during the war, now barely speaking, divided by politics and perceived betrayals. Truman sat through Eisenhower's inaugural address, which implicitly criticized the Truman administration's foreign policy and promised a new approach to the Cold War. The ceremony was the last time Truman would participate in official Washington for years to come. After the inauguration, Truman and Bess left Washington by train. The famous departure that became iconic images of the former president as ordinary citizen. There was no Secret Service protection that wouldn't become permanent for ex-presidents until the 1965 law. Truman had refused offers of corporate board positions, refusing to capitalize on his former office for personal profit. He'd returned to independence with an Army pension of $112.56 per month, and no other income beyond the book deal for his memoirs. The train journey was documented by journalists who noted Truman's relief and genuine happiness to be leaving. He waved from the back platform, smiled for cameras, seemed decades younger without the presidency's weight. Back in Independence, Truman would spend his retirement writing memoirs, building his presidential library, the first comprehensive presidential library, setting the model for future presidents, taking daily morning walks around town, where neighbors would see the former president strolling alone, unguarded, greeting people by name. His reputation would slowly transform over the next 2 decades, from the unpopular president of 1953 to the revered give-him-hell Harry of historical memory. Historians would rank him among the near-great presidents, praising his decisiveness, his willingness to make difficult choices, his fundamental decency despite rough language and machine politics background. But in January 1953, he left office despised by a significant portion of Americans, blamed for the Korean stalemate, attacked as soft on communism, rejected by voters who wanted change after 20 years of Democratic presidencies. His graceful departure, despite deep unpopularity, maintained constitutional tradition. The peaceful transfer occurred regardless of approval ratings, regardless of personal feelings between outgoing and incoming presidents, regardless of ongoing wars or political rancor. The presidential seal transferred from the most consequential accidental president to the most popular war hero. From deep unpopularity to landslide victory, from Midwestern machine politician to Kansas farm boy who'd become supreme Allied commander. Truman went home by train, unguarded, essentially broke, and somehow happier than he'd been in years. January 20th, 1953, arrived with Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration. Truman attended graciously despite having little warmth for Eek, who'd run as a Republican after Truman had once considered him as a potential Democratic candidate. Truman left Washington without permanent Secret Service protection, that wouldn't become standard for ex-presidents until 1965. He drove himself home to Missouri, then took the train to Independence, the journey documented by journalists. He'd spend retirement writing memoirs, building his presidential library, watching his reputation slowly transform from unpopular president to revered elder statesman. He died in 1972, by then respected for the difficult decisions he'd made. His graceful departure, despite deep unpopularity, maintained constitutional tradition. The peaceful transfer occurred regardless of approval ratings. Dwight D. Eisenhower's final day as president, January 19, 1961, came 3 days after delivering his famous farewell address, warning about the military-industrial complex. That speech would become his most remembered contribution, warning about threats he'd helped create during his presidency. The permanent war economy, defense contractors' political power, the merger of military and industrial interests. Ike saw the danger but hadn't constrained it while in office. His farewell was a warning about forces he'd failed to control. January 20 arrived freezing cold. Eisenhower attended John F. Kennedy's inauguration despite the generation gap and political differences. At 70, he was the oldest president to leave office naturally. At 43, Kennedy was the youngest elected president. The contrast was deliberate. Kennedy's torch has been passed to a new generation speech emphasized youth replacing age. Eisenhower left for his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he'd spend retirement painting, golfing, watching politics from distance. He'd warned about threats he'd helped create, then left office having failed to actually constrain those forces. His warning mattered more than his actions. The presidential seal transferred from old general to young senator, from one era to another. November 22, 1963, began with John F. Kennedy attending a morning cabinet meeting to discuss domestic policy before leaving for a political trip to Texas. The visit aimed to heal divisions in the Texas Democratic Party and shore up support for his 1964 re-election campaign. By mid-morning, Kennedy was in Dallas, riding in an open-top Lincoln Continental through downtown streets lined with cheering crowds. He sat beside his wife Jackie in the back seat, with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie in jump seats. Secret Service agents rode in cars ahead and behind, but the president was exposed, visible, vulnerable. At 12:30 p.m. in Dealey Plaza, shots rang out. The motorcade was passing the Texas School Book Depository when bullets struck Kennedy, one in the upper back, one in the head. The presidential limousine raced to Parkland Hospital. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, climbing onto the back of the car to shield the president and First Lady. But the head wound was catastrophic, unsurvivable. Doctors worked frantically in Trauma Room 1, but Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. He was 46 years old, had served 1,036 days as president. Jackie Kennedy refused to change out of her blood-stained pink Chanel suit, reportedly saying, "Let them see what they've done." Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who'd been 2 cars behind in the motorcade, was rushed to Love Field Airport and Air Force One. At 2:38 p.m., federal judge Sarah T. Hughes administered the presidential oath aboard the aircraft. Jackie stood beside Johnson, still wearing the suit stained with her husband's blood, one of the most haunting images in American history. Kennedy's body was placed in a casket and loaded onto the plane. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested that afternoon for killing a Dallas police officer, then charged with Kennedy's assassination. 2 days later, on November 24, while being transferred between jails, Oswald was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby on live television, the first murder broadcast live on TV. Oswald died without standing trial, leaving conspiracy theories that persist 60 years later. Kennedy's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. The funeral procession through Washington on November 25 was watched by millions. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The assassination, captured on film by Abraham Zapruder, was the most documented presidential murder in history. The presidential seal, transferred via bullets in broad daylight, national trauma broadcast live, and Johnson inherited not just the presidency, but the Kennedy mystique that would complicate his own political future. Lyndon B. Johnson's final day as president, January 19, 1969, came after he'd announced on March 31, 1968, that he wouldn't seek re-election. Vietnam had destroyed his presidency despite the Great Society's domestic achievements, Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights legislation, voting rights, the war on poverty. But the war consumed everything. By early 1968, after the Tet Offensive showed the war was far from won despite optimistic military reports, Johnson's approval rating had collapsed. His withdrawal announcement shocked the nation. I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president. His final day was routine transition work, though the emotional exhaustion was documented by aides. January 20th, 1969, arrived with Richard Nixon's inauguration. Nixon, who'd lost to Kennedy in 1960, now succeeding Kennedy's successor. Johnson attended the ceremony, watching his vice president Hubert Humphrey's loss to Nixon, a Republican who'd promised peace with honor in Vietnam. The war Johnson had escalated was still raging and would continue for 4 more years. Over 58,000 Americans would die in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese would die. Johnson left Washington immediately, returning to his Texas ranch where he'd spend 4 years in retirement. He grew his hair long, stopped exercising, smoked heavily, and died on January 22, 1973, one day before the Paris Peace Accords were signed ending American involvement in Vietnam. The timing was almost cruelly poetic. The war that destroyed his presidency ended the day after he died. Johnson had accomplished more domestically than almost any president transforming American society through civil rights and social programs. But Vietnam overshadowed everything. His departure was peaceful, but exhausted. A man who'd chosen not to continue a presidency the war had made untenable. Richard Nixon's resignation on August 8, 1974, and departure on August 9 were unprecedented. The only presidential resignation in American history. The Watergate scandal had consumed his second term. What began as a break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters in June 1972 evolved into revelations of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. The smoking gun tape from June 23, 1972, released on August 5, 1974, proved Nixon had ordered the FBI to stop investigating Watergate for political reasons. Republican support collapsed. Senator Barry Goldwater and other Republican leaders told Nixon he'd be impeached and convicted. On August 8, Nixon announced his resignation in a televised address at 9:01 p.m. His final night in office, documented by Henry Kissinger, was spent in emotional conversation with his Secretary of State. The next morning, August 9th, Nixon delivered a rambling, emotional farewell speech to White House staff in the East Room. He reminisced about his mother, his father, his career, barely coherent, breaking down while discussing Theodore Roosevelt's grief. At 11:35 a.m., he and Pat Nixon walked to Marine One on the South Lawn. He turned, gave his characteristic double victory sign, wildly inappropriate given the circumstances, and the helicopter lifted off. The image became iconic, Nixon's final gesture of defiance or delusion, departing in disgrace while pretending triumph. At noon, while Nixon's helicopter was still in flight, Gerald Ford took the presidential oath in the East Room, declaring our long national nightmare is over. Nixon flew to California, avoiding the capital he'd left in disgrace. Ford would pardon him on September 8, preventing any criminal prosecution. Nixon would spend his remaining 20 years rebuilding his reputation through books and foreign policy commentary, but he'd never escape Watergate's shadow. His departure broke the unbroken chain of normal presidential transitions, proving the system could survive even resignation, even disgrace, even a president fleeing, rather than facing accountability. Gerald Ford's final day as president, January 19, 1977, came at the end of the only unelected presidency in American history. He'd been appointed vice president under the 25th Amendment in December 1973 after Spiro Agnew resigned in a bribery scandal. When Nixon resigned in August 1974, Ford became president without ever having been elected to national office. His presidency was defined by one decision, pardoning Nixon on September 8, 1974, barely a month after taking office. Ford believed the pardon was necessary to spare the nation a prolonged trial and allow healing to begin. The decision likely cost him the 1976 election. January 20, 1977, arrived with Jimmy Carter's inauguration. Ford attended gracefully, maintaining peaceful transfer tradition despite having lost to a relatively unknown Georgia governor. Betty Ford, who'd been remarkably candid about her breast cancer and addiction struggles, left the White House having transformed expectations of First Ladies' openness about health issues. Ford left Washington for California, where he'd enjoy a long retirement, eventually becoming the longest-lived president at 93, dying in 2006. His unelected presidency had restored some normalcy after Nixon's disgrace. His defeat by Carter was directly traceable to the Nixon pardon, but Ford maintained he'd made the right choice. The presidential seal transferred from the only unelected president to an outsider promising honesty after years of scandal. Jimmy Carter's final day as president, January 19, 1981, was spent desperately negotiating for the release of American hostages held in Iran for 444 days. 52 Americans had been held since November 4, 1979, when Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Every day of captivity had been a public humiliation for Carter and America. ABC News started Nightline as a show counting days of captivity. Carter stayed up all night on January 1920, working phones, negotiating terms, desperately trying to secure their release before Ronald Reagan's inauguration at noon. January 20 arrived with Carter exhausted from the all-night session. He attended Reagan's inauguration, having not slept, watching Reagan take the oath. 20 minutes after Reagan was sworn in, at 12:20 p.m., Iran released the hostages. The timing was deliberate, a final humiliation, denying Carter any credit for their freedom after months of negotiation. The Iranians had delayed release specifically to hand Reagan the victory and deny Carter the triumph. Carter left Washington immediately, devastated by the timing, beginning what would become the most consequential post-presidency in American history. He'd build homes with Habitat for Humanity, monitor elections worldwide, write dozens of books, win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his peace and human rights work. His post-presidency redeemed a presidency remembered for hostages, gas lines, and malaise, though he never actually used that word. His departure was humiliating, denied victory at the last possible moment, but his life after the presidency proved more influential than most actual presidencies. January 19, 1989, found Ronald Reagan in the White House at the end of 8 years that had transformed American politics and culture. He was leaving at peak popularity. His approval rating stood at 63%, one of the highest for a departing president. The Reagan Revolution had reshaped the Republican Party, shifted national politics rightward, ended the Cold War through negotiation from strength with Mikhail Gorbachev, and restored a sense of American optimism after the malaise of the 1970s. His final day was routine transition work, preparing for George H.W. Bush's assumption of office. But the mood was upbeat, celebratory, triumphant. January 20 arrived cold but clear. Reagan attended Bush's inauguration enthusiastically, passing power to his loyal vice president who'd served 8 years supporting Reagan's agenda. Bush had earned the succession through loyalty, defending Reagan even when he disagreed privately, standing beside him through Iran-Contra scandal and other controversies. The ceremony was smooth, the transition seamless, power passing from the Reagan era to what was essentially Reagan's third term, at least initially. Reagan delivered brief remarks praising Bush, gave his blessing to the succession, then departed Washington for California. He and Nancy settled in Bel Air, returning to the state where Reagan had been governor before becoming president. They'd enjoy retirement together, appearing at Republican events, giving occasional speeches, maintaining a public presence. But 5 years later, in November 1994, Reagan announced he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He wrote a handwritten letter to America explaining his condition. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America there will always be a bright dawn ahead. The letter was characteristically optimistic, Reagan maintaining his sunny disposition even while revealing devastating news. The diagnosis raised uncomfortable questions about when symptoms had begun. Some aides and observers later suggested signs had been present during his second term. Moments of confusion, difficulty tracking conversations, occasional disorientation. Nancy Reagan fiercely protected him through his final decade, controlling access, managing his decline with the same determination she'd brought to managing his political career. Reagan lived until June 2004, dying at 93 after a decade of progressively worsening dementia. His state funeral was the first presidential funeral in 30 years. His departure in 1989 was triumphant, leaving at peak popularity, passing power to his chosen successor, the Reagan era apparently secure. But the Alzheimer's diagnosis 5 years later cast retrospective shadow on those final years. Had symptoms been present during his presidency? Had decisions been made by a president whose cognitive decline had already begun? Nancy later acknowledged she'd noticed changes in the second term but attributed them to stress and aging rather than disease. Reagan's departure thus became complicated in retrospect, a successful exit that raised questions about what had been happening behind the scenes. Whether the sunny optimism had masked neurological decline, whether the nation had been governed partly by instinct and staff management rather than fully engaged presidential decision-making. George H.W. Bush's final day as president, January 19, 1993, came after losing re-election despite winning the Gulf War. He'd defeated Iraq in 1991, liberating Kuwait in an overwhelming military victory that took just 42 days, demonstrating American military supremacy in the post-Cold War world. His approval rating hit 89% in March 1991, but he lost the 1992 election to Bill Clinton, a young Arkansas governor who focused relentlessly on domestic issues. Clinton's campaign slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid," emphasizing the recession that had made Bush vulnerable despite foreign policy success. Bush spent his final day writing a letter to Clinton, which he left in the Oval Office desk drawer. The letter, later made public with Bush's permission, demonstrated grace and defeat, dear Bill. When I walked into this office just now, I felt the same sense of wonder and respect that I felt 4 years ago. I know you will feel that too. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have described. There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you. Good luck, George. The letter exemplified Bush's patrician decency, his belief in institutional continuity transcending partisan competition. January 20th, 1993, arrived with Clinton's inauguration. Bush attended gracefully, sitting through the ceremony of a Democrat half his age, taking the office he'd just lost. The irony wasn't subtle. Clinton had defeated him. Bush was the son of a senator. Clinton was the son of a traveling salesman who died before Clinton was born. The generational and class contrasts were stark. Bush left Washington for Houston, where he'd spend the next 25 years in active retirement. He eventually developed a close friendship with Clinton, the two working together on humanitarian projects after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, becoming an unlikely paired symbol of bipartisan cooperation. Bush's sons would both enter politics, George W. becoming Texas governor then president, Jeb becoming Florida governor. The Bush family dynasty continued even as Bush himself exited the presidency. He died in November 2018 at 94. Having watched his son serve 8 years as president, having reconciled with the man who defeated him. His graceful letter and dignified departure set a standard for how defeated presidents should exit, acknowledging loss while wishing successors well. Bill Clinton's final day as president, January 19th, 2001, was consumed by last-minute pardons that would tarnish his otherwise successful departure. Between midnight and dawn, he issued 140 pardons and commutations, a clemency spree that included some highly controversial choices. The Mark Rich pardon was particularly scandalous. Rich was a fugitive financier who'd fled to Switzerland in 1983 to avoid prosecution for tax evasion, more than $48 million in taxes, and illegal trading with Iran during the 1979-1980 hostage crisis. Rich's ex-wife Denise had donated $450,000 to Clinton's presidential library and over $100,000 to Hillary's Senate campaign. The pardon looked like purchased clemency. Clinton had been impeached in December 1998 on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice related to the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the Paula Jones sexual harassment lawsuit. The Senate acquitted him in February 1999, falling well short of the two-thirds needed to convict. He left office with approval ratings around 66%, popular despite the scandals. His presidency remembered for economic prosperity and balanced budgets despite personal misconduct. His final hours were spent signing pardons, including controversial ones for his half-brother Roger Clinton, Susan McDougal, and others with questionable justifications. January 20th, 2001, arrived with George W. Bush's inauguration, the son of the man Clinton had defeated in 1992, now succeeding Clinton. The irony was thick. Clinton attended the ceremony, watched Bush take the oath, maintain constitutional tradition. His wife Hillary had just been sworn in as senator from New York on January 3rd, becoming the first First Lady elected to public office. The Clinton political dynasty was continuing through Hillary even as Bill left the presidency. They left Washington for New York, where both would maintain political relevance. Hillary eventually running for president in 2008 and 2016, Bill becoming one of the most sought-after speakers and fundraisers in Democratic politics. Clinton's departure was complicated, leaving office popular but ethically tarnished by last-minute pardons, impeached but acquitted, successful by many measures but personally compromised. The Mark Rich pardon particularly haunted his legacy, seeming to confirm critics' view that Clinton's ethics were situational, that access and donations could purchase favorable treatment. His graceful attendance at Bush's inauguration maintained tradition, but the pardon controversy ensured his exit would be remembered as ethically questionable despite his policy successes and sustained popularity. George W. Bush's final day as president, January 19, 2009, came during two ongoing wars and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The Iraq War, launched in March 2003 on false premises about weapons of mass destruction, was still consuming American lives and resources. Afghanistan, where the war had begun in October 2001 after the September 11 attacks, continued without resolution. The financial crisis that exploded in September 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the near failure of the entire banking system, the auto industry bailouts, had Bush leaving office during economic catastrophe. His approval rating stood at 22%, tied with Truman for the lowest departing approval rating. His final day was routine transition work, briefing Barack Obama's team on ongoing crises, signing last-minute orders, preparing to hand off two wars and an economic disaster. January 20th, 2009, arrived with historic significance. Obama was becoming the first African-American president, a symbolic achievement that seemed to repudiate Bush's 8 years. The crowd was massive, estimated at 1.8 million people, gathering to witness the historic inauguration. Bush attended the ceremony, sitting on the platform while Obama delivered an inaugural address that implicitly criticized Bush's policies without naming him. Dick Cheney, Bush's vice president, who'd been the administration's most powerful and controversial figure, attended in a wheelchair. He'd injured his back moving boxes while packing to leave office. The image was almost symbolic. the administration departing broken and injured, turning over to new leadership. Bush left the Capitol by helicopter immediately after Obama's swearing in, the tradition of the departing president helicoptering away while the new president assumed office. He flew to Andrews Air Force Base, then to Texas, immediately retiring from public political life. Bush would spend his post-presidency painting, writing memoirs, avoiding political commentary in a way unusual for recent ex-presidents. He developed an unexpected friendship with Michelle Obama, their warm interactions at public events becoming fodder for viral moments. He deliberately stayed out of political debates, declined to criticize Obama publicly, maintained dignified silence even when Democrats attacked his legacy. His departure came during multiple ongoing crises, wars he'd started, economic collapse triggered partly by deregulation his administration had championed. He left office deeply unpopular, but unlike other failed presidencies, he seemed to accept responsibility and retreat from defending his record. Barack Obama's final day as president, January 19, 2017, came with the particularly bitter awareness that his successor had spent years questioning his legitimacy as president. Donald Trump had led the birther conspiracy theory starting around 2011, claiming Obama wasn't born in America and thus wasn't eligible to be president. Racist conspiracy, mongering that Obama had endured throughout his presidency. Trump had demanded Obama release his birth certificate, continued pushing the conspiracy even after Obama released the long-form certificate in 2011, and never fully apologized or recanted. Now, Obama was preparing to hand power to the conspiracy theorist who'd attacked his legitimacy. Obama spent his final day writing the traditional letter to his successor, maintaining the custom George H.W. Bush had established despite the hostile relationship. The letter's contents remained private initially, following tradition, though Trump would later describe it as beautiful and complex. Obama's staff spent final hours completing transition work, briefing Trump's team despite philosophical differences and concerns about the incoming administration's competence and intentions. January 20, 2017, arrived cold and rainy. Obama attended Trump's inauguration, sitting on the platform with other dignitaries, while Trump delivered a dark American carnage inaugural address that painted America as failing and broken, an implicit rejection of Obama's 8 years. Michelle Obama was visibly uncomfortable throughout, documented in photographs showing her tight expression and forced smiles. When Melania Trump arrived at the White House before the ceremony and gave Michelle a gift, Michelle's expression of barely concealed dismay became a viral image. The Obamas maintained dignity despite the personal insults Trump had directed at them for years, attended the ceremony, participated in the peaceful transfer of power, and left Washington immediately afterward. But unusually, they didn't leave the city. Obama rented a house in the Kalorama neighborhood, staying in Washington to allow his younger daughter Sasha to finish high school. This decision, unprecedented for a departing president to remain in the Capitol, also allowed Obama to remain close to political action, though he initially maintained traditional ex-presidential restraint about publicly criticizing his successor. Obama's departure maintained constitutional norms despite his successor's years of racist conspiracy mongering, demonstrated grace under circumstances that would justify bitterness, and transferred power peacefully to a man who'd questioned his legitimacy. The presidential seal transferred from the first black president to a man who'd led racist attacks questioning that president's citizenship, a moment that exposed the tensions and divisions in American society that Obama's presidency had both highlighted and failed to resolve. January 19, 2021, began with Donald Trump's last-minute pardons, 143 pardons and commutations issued overnight in his final hours. The list included Steve Bannon, his former chief strategist, who'd been charged with fraud related to a private border wall fundraising scheme. Trump had been impeached twice, first in December 2019 for pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, acquitted by the Senate in February 2020, then again on January 13, 2021, for inciting the January 6 Capitol insurrection when his supporters attacked Congress during the certification of Biden's electoral victory. The second impeachment trial would occur after he left office, with the Senate ultimately acquitting him again in February 2021. Trump refused to attend Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20, becoming the fourth president to skip his successor's oath, and the first since Andrew Johnson in 1869 to break that 152-year tradition. Instead, Trump organized his own departure ceremony at Joint Base Andrews at 8 a.m. Hail to the Chief played for about 200 supporters who'd come to see him off, a self-organized farewell with military honors that felt like a counter-ceremony to the constitutionally mandated inauguration happening later that day. His wife Melania attended the Andrews ceremony. His Vice President Mike Pence did not. Pence chose to attend Biden's inauguration instead, a final break after Trump had spent weeks pressuring Pence to unconstitutionally reject electoral votes on January 6. Trump's speech at Andrews was rambling, claiming credit for various achievements, promising we'll be back in some form, refusing to explicitly acknowledge Biden's legitimacy. He flew to Florida before Biden took the oath at noon. At exactly 12:01 p.m., while Trump was mid-flight, the nuclear codes transferred electronically to Biden, and the airplane's call sign changed from Air Force One to Special Air Mission 28000. Trump was no longer president, just a passenger on a government plane heading to his private club. He landed in Florida as former president, no longer holding office, facing ongoing investigations that would lead to 4 criminal indictments over the next 2 years, 2 federal cases, ossified documents, January 6, 2 state cases, Georgia election interference, New York financial records. His refusal to attend broke modern precedent, while 3 previous presidents had skipped inaugurations, both Adamses and Johnson, all had been in the 19th century. Trump's absence was the first time in the modern presidency, with its 24/7 media coverage and symbolic importance, that a departing president refused to attend. His departure came during ongoing investigations into his role in the January 6 attack on the Capitol, his removal of classified documents to Mar-a-Lago, his attempts to overturn the 2020 election in multiple states. The peaceful transfer of power occurred. Biden was sworn in on schedule, but Trump's refusal to attend, his false claims about election fraud, his role in the January 6 violence, all represented unprecedented challenges to democratic norms that had held for over 2 centuries. Joe Biden's final day as president, January 19, 2025, came exactly 4 years after he'd taken office in the shadow of the January 6 insurrection. At 82, he was the oldest president ever to leave office, surpassing Reagan's record. His presidency had been defined by age from the beginning. Questions about his mental acuity, his verbal stumbles, whether he could complete a full term. Those questions had intensified throughout 2024, ultimately leading to his decision not to seek re-election. The announcement had come after mounting pressure from within his own party following a difficult debate performance that raised concerns about his fitness for a second term. His final day was routine transition work, briefing his successor's team, a process made easier by Biden's institutional knowledge from his own 8 years as Obama's vice president. He understood presidential transitions from both sides, having participated in the 2009 and 2017 transitions, and was determined to provide the professional handoff Trump had refused to give him 4 years earlier. January 20th, 2025, arrived cold but clear. Biden attended his successor's inauguration, deliberately restoring the tradition Trump had broken. He sat on the platform despite the cold, despite his age, despite whatever personal feelings he had about leaving office and about his successor. The symbolism was intentional. After Trump's unprecedented refusal to attend, Biden was demonstrating that norms could be restored, that constitutional traditions were bigger than individual grievances. He'd written the traditional letter to his successor, left it in the Oval Office desk as Bush had done for him, though Trump had left one too, despite refusing to attend. Biden's attendance was his final presidential act, showing up, maintaining tradition, proving democracy continued. He'd restored the norm Trump broke, demonstrated that the system could heal from norm violations, that peaceful transfers could resume even after disruption. Biden left Washington for Delaware, returning to Wilmington where he'd commuted from during his Senate years. where his family was buried, where he'd always found refuge from Washington politics. He left as the oldest departing president, having restored attendance tradition, having completed the transition he'd been denied. His vice president, Kamala Harris, had lost the 2024 election, meaning Biden was handing power to the opposition party, the pattern of American democracy continuing regardless of who won. The presidential seal transferred from the oldest president to his successor, the tradition restored. The attendance precedent established after Trump's 4-year interruption. 45 different departures across 240 years. Some graceful, some bitter, some in caskets, some in helicopters, some before dawn to avoid watching. 8 died in office, 4 from natural causes or medical incompetence, 4 from assassins' bullets. 1 resigned before certain impeachment, helicoptering away with victory signs while leaving in disgrace. 4 refused to attend their successors' inaugurations, 2 Adamses fleeing before dawn, Andrew Johnson after surviving impeachment, Donald Trump breaking 152 years of modern tradition. The rest showed up and watched power change hands, maintaining the precedent Washington established in 1797 that attendance was the graceful choice even when not constitutionally required. The building stayed. The desk stayed. The seal stayed. The Constitution held through assassinations, resignations, impeachments, civil war, world wars, depressions, scandals, and personal hatreds that should have broken lesser systems. Power transferred on schedule every 4 or 8 years, whether peacefully or bitterly, whether the departing president attended or fled, whether they left beloved or despised, triumphant or humiliated, alive or dead. The presidential seal moved from person to person, hand to hand, generation to generation, proving the office was always temporary and the republic would survive any individual's exit. Washington proved you could voluntarily surrender power. Adams proved you could refuse to watch, but the system worked anyway. Lincoln died, and the republic survived assassination. Nixon resigned, and the Constitution held. Trump refused to attend, but Biden restored the tradition 4 years later, showing norms could be rebuilt after breaking. The pattern is clear. The person leaves. The office continues. The system is stronger than any individual's feelings about it. That's not inspirational rhetoric. That's 240 years of documented reality, from handwritten letters in Philadelphia to mid-flight nuclear code transfers, from stagecoach departures to helicopter exits, from yellow fever to Alzheimer's, from single-shot pistols to security details that couldn't prevent bullets in Dallas. The uncomfortable truth that makes this a bedtime story rather than a horror story is this: it works. Not perfectly. We've had terrible presidents, catastrophic decisions, wars that didn't need to happen, scandals that exposed corruption, moments when democracy felt fragile. But it works. The office transfers. The republic continues. The desk gets a new occupant every 4 or 8 years, whether the previous one wants to leave or not, whether they depart gracefully or bitterly, whether they attend the ceremony or flee before dawn. The presidential seal is still on the wall, waiting for number 47, 48, 49. Whoever comes next, whoever leaves next, however they choose to exit when their time comes. If you made it this far tonight, thank you for staying through all 45 departures, from Washington's revolutionary peaceful transfer in 1797 to Biden's norm-restoring attendance just last week in 2025. Next time, we'll be covering the forgotten political scandals that nearly destroyed the republic, backroom deals, quiet corruption, and the machinery of power that official histories prefer to skip. Until then, sleep well.